First of all, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Mr. Hamouzi for this special opportunity, and I also want to thank the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research for generously hosting this event. And so I think it's important that we start with sort of an assessment of where we stand globally currently. If we look at the past 100 years of global economic history, during the 1929 to 1933 Great Depression era, US's GDP contracted 26% from peak to trough, and it took about 8 years for the economy to get back to 1929 level, only in 1937. And during the 2008 to 2009 Great Recession, as painful as the memory still seems to linger, the US GDP actually only contracted about 4.6% from peak to trough, and it took about only 2 years to recover. And so now, in looking at the GDP output contraction for China in particular, because it was the first country that was infected basically with COVID-19, and for the first quarter GDP that was announced Friday, China's first quarter GDP growth slid or contracted 6.8% year over year. And it's indeed the worst quarter China has ever seen since GDP methodology was adopted in assessing the Chinese economic system. And so similarly, Goldman Sachs, as well as UBS, other investment banks, they have come up with predictions that in the second quarter, there will be likely a double-digit contraction for the United States and also for the European economies, possibly even in a weaker scenario. And so China, during the first quarter, was primarily hit with a supply side shock, I would say. You know, factories couldn't open, they couldn't produce. But in the second quarter, as the rest of the world, you know, mostly China's customers are in lockdown, China is now primarily experiencing and will be experiencing a demand side shock, which will drag much longer before this economy recovers. And it's really hard to see that China will singularly recover unless the rest of the world recovers with it. And so the world is hit with today a compounded public health and economic crisis. And so we cannot really today reasonably to start to talk about a timetable of economic recovery until the public health side stabilizes. And so in terms of the economic severity, we are somewhere in between the Great Recession and the Great Depression levels. And so basically we're in between a 5% economic contraction and a 25% economic contraction spectrum. And so if we are containing this virus globally very effectively, we are probably sliding back more towards the Great Recession level. But if this COVID-19 crisis continues to drag on, we're probably getting closer economically to a Great Depression level. And so really, I think that just gives us a sort of a spectrum of the uncertainty, not only that, but also the range of economic consequences that we face collectively as a world economic body. And so let's look at specifically where China stands, because it does serve as sort of the case study. And so there's a feeling that China is entering into a post-COVID-19 era now. In Beijing, we're starting to see traffic jams for the first time for a long time, which is a good sign. Also, Tesla sold 12,000 cars in March in China alone from its brand new super factory in Shanghai. So China seems to have survived the worst part of the public health crisis since March. However, we're starting to see a surge of confirmed cases in cities like Harbin in the northeast and Guangzhou in the south. And schools are still closed in China, or I should say many. Movie theaters were opened, but now they are suspended again. And so there are latent risks of a possible second wave. But China, I think, still remains cautiously optimistic. And so at the end of February, the Deputy Central Bank Governor of the PBOC, Chen Yulu, he talked about a V-shaped economic recovery. And I think now with what we're seeing in the rest of the world, it would probably look more like a U-shaped economic recovery. But if indeed there were a possible second wave hitting China, we probably will be looking at even a W-shaped recovery. It'll take a long time. And so if we were to look at the sub-segments of China's GDP growth as was released in the first quarter numbers on Friday, the three horses of the Chinese economy have all been crippled, basically. So China has been relying very heavily upon this, what's called the three horses, or three growth engines of the Chinese economy, and that's consumption, trade, and the investments. And so if we were to look at these three components respectively, retail sales were down roughly about 16%, fixed asset investment was down a little over 16%, and so it's actually rather interesting that it's actually trade, particularly export, that has been holding China's first quarter GDP up. Otherwise it could have been perhaps an even deeper economic contraction. And so if we were to look at trade, the trade will remain weak and a weak part of China's economic growth story. The export-led economic growth model for China is gone. Last year, 78% of China's economic growth came from the services industry, and 56% was from consumer spending. And so the Chinese economy has fundamentally transformed itself from an export-led economy to a consumption-driven economy. And so rather than seeing this trade sort of holding China's GDP up for the first quarter, I think more likely we are going to continue to see trade being pushed on the sidelines. It's not likely that trade will be the major part of China's economic growth. I think that era is gone. And so consumption has been China's main growth engine since 2019, and actually a couple of years before that. But it's actually also been the hardest hit currently. It affects the COVID-19 affects restaurants, retail, tourism, just like what we see everywhere else. But China's tourism industry currently employs 800 million people. So it's a very labor-intensive industry, and it's important for the Chinese government to get these industries, critical industries, back to normal, not just for the very reasons of GDP recovery, but it's also for employment stability. 800 million people in one single tourism industry. It is a lot. It means employment stability, and for a country such as China, it also means social stability, which is crucial for China's political and economic architecture. And so now the consumption recovery will take time, obviously, and I would even argue that some of the lost consumption is not recoverable. Say, for example, I cannot have 2 meals a night for the rest of the year just to recover for the lost demand in the first half of the year. And there's only one Valentine's, one Easter, one Mother's Day, one daughter's birthday. You know, how do you recover these consumption demands once it's lost? And I would say actually a lot of them is lost forever. And so China will continue to stimulate domestic consumption. Now, 2.5 days weekend has been entertained by some cities. And over the past few weeks, China has started to issue digital coupons across many metropolises to stimulate online shopping, online sports, online catering, and tourism. And it's actually very interesting. What we see in the US is that the $2.2 trillion of fiscal rescue was used primarily for unemployment benefits, healthcare, etc., but also to give up to $1,200 of cash to every American. China has not resorted to giving cash, but China resorted to giving digital coupons. And so China has a very high savings rate. As of 2019, it stands at 45%. 45% of China's GDP, it's saved. And so if you were to give cash to Chinese, they would just turn around and deposit it in banks. And so digital coupon is absolutely a pragmatic way of stimulating consumption. But not only that, it's a fraction of the cost to the Chinese government in comparison to giving cash. And so some research suggests that for every 1 RMB's worth of a digital coupon, 15 RMB's worth is 15 times worth of actual consumption will be stimulated from Chinese consumers in a sector such as tourism. So the multiplier effect of the digital coupons is actually higher than cash. And the other obvious benefit is that digital coupon is traceable, and this traceability enables governments and companies to know where the coupons are most effective, who is using it, and where they are being or how they are being used. And so this traceability is something that cash does not offer. And that really gives the government even more insights into very precise ways of further consumption stimulus programs. But again, consumption is very much led by income and jobs recovery, and so it's going to take time. And really the most effective way as seen by the Chinese government for economic recovery on a massive level is really by government-led investment. And that is very Keynesian in a way, and I would say very Franklin D. Roosevelt. And indeed, that is how Franklin D. Roosevelt put the US economy out of the Great Depression by resorting to government-led infrastructure programs. And really, when there is a severe demand shock, which is where we are seeing globally now, government's job is to build infrastructure to create demand, but also to create jobs. And that's very much what Keynes described in his general theory. Government should dig holes and fill it again, and dig it again and fill it again. And so basically, what we are seeing today, China's government, from the national to the local level, combined have tabled infrastructure development projects somewhere in the amount of $4.5 trillion US dollars. And that is massive. However, I do want to say that it's different from the 2.2 trillion that's signed off by the White House. China's infrastructure development program, this package, is not an immediate liquidity injection into the system. Rather, investment is going to be spent over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's a major difference. But at the beginning of March, NDRC, China's economic policy planning body, has announced a massive new infrastructure development plan. And it's new because it is digital. China's new infrastructure development plan, in the size, again, in trillions of RMB, will develop exclusively 5G networks, big data centers, smart city developments, and Internet of Things, AI technology, and all of these things that are digital and 5G driven. And so this very much an infrastructure program with a digital tilt will not only rescue the Chinese economy, but also it echoes China's Vision 2030 for China to turn into a major global technology leader. And so it's really giving China, I think, starting from this crisis, a opportunity, a window of opportunity for China to develop a complete technological edge with the new digital infrastructure development plan for the coming decade. And so other considerations for China this year is the closing year of China's 13th five-year plan. We all know that China has been very skillful in developing these long-term five-year policy plannings. And so this is the final year of the 13th, which the current Chinese president, Xi, this is basically in his conception. He conceived the 13th five-year plan, and this is the very first five-year plan that he's presided over in full term. And so it's really important that it gets executed properly, despite all the difficulties. And so one of the the bottom line criteria for the 13th five-year plan is poverty elimination. So given the current situation, the World Bank Organization has assessed that China has lifted over 800 million people out of poverty. And so now we have a very small number to go in China to say that China has completely eliminated absolute poverty by 2020. And so with all the numbers and assessments, we probably have a little less than 10 million people to go in China. But it's important by the end of the year that every single person in China who have been living under absolute poverty lines will be absolutely lifted. And next, I want to talk about China-US. And because this pair, the duality, the relationship between the world's two largest economies fundamentally has a spillover effect to all the regions around the world. And so the first one is really trade war implementation. China is currently purchasing agriculture in bulk quantities from the US.
Shirley, you have 1 minute left. 1 minute left, yeah?
Oh, is it? Just 1 minute. So the agricultural trade, as we see now, there is a fundamental disruption to the global food supply chain. And so that's very important that it's in China's interest to continue to execute the agricultural commitments. But as far as the $80 billion in manufacturing and $40 billion in energy, it is, I think, at the moment, both US and China are thinking about, well, let's wait and see how this COVID-19 situation pans out. But it's important to understand that trade is really a small part of the puzzle, because China and the US further decoupling, I think that is a trend that is inevitable. But it also means a global recalibration of supply chains, and that'll potentially bring benefit to all regional economies. Say, for example, ASEAN has seen double-digit growth with trade both with China and with the United States. Europe has become a large trade beneficiary, and also China has invested $150 billion in the MENA region through the Belt and Road Initiative. China has built its the world's largest solar tower in the UAE. And also Huawei had signed the very first 5G core infrastructure development network in the Middle East. And so all of these things means that the MENA region can become a potential quintessential partner for this whole recalibration of the global supply chain, but also the digitization of China and its potential expansion throughout the region. And so there is a lot of opportunities to look after. And I think the digitization process, as we see how China resolves this COVID-19 crisis, China has digitized using AI technologies to start trying to develop an app to basically gauge the nation's mobility. Every Chinese is given a color code to basically indicate if they are green, that means they are safe to move around. If they're red, they should be home quarantined. And so AI solutions, as we can see, are very effective for populous countries and regions in a way that it's impossible for human capacity to accomplish these. And I think the digitization process is where China...
I have to stop.